The Night Before Christmas by Jan Brett. A poem by Clement Moore. I'm going to do that over again. The Night Before Christmas, a poem by Clement Moore, illustrated by Jan Brett. The Night Before Christmas, a poem by Clement Moore, illustrated by Jan Brett. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mamma in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled down for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there rose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eye should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen. To the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky, so up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with a sleigh full of toys and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk. And laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew, like the down on a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night." How Santa Got His Job by Stephen Krensky, illustrated by S.D. Schindler. How Santa Got His Job. When Santa Claus was a young man, he went out looking for a job. Santa wanted no part of desks or offices. He liked to stay on the move. His first job was cleaning chimneys. Santa was sure-footed on even the steepest roofs, and he loved twisting through the tight spaces. But there was a problem. Santa was so neat that he never got covered in soot or made a mess in the fireplace, so nobody believed him when he said he was done. "Where's the proof?" said some. "You're not even dirty," said others. This led to a lot of arguments. Santa worked for the post office next, where everyone could see that he was doing his job. Santa's favorite part was bringing packages to people all over town. Waiting in traffic was frustrating, though. It's silly to waste all this time, he decided. To speed things up, he started making deliveries in the middle of the night. But there was a problem. No one was glad to see him at that hour. The postmaster got so many complaining letters that Santa had to leave. Since Santa had discovered he enjoyed staying up late, he tried cooking at an all-night diner. It felt good to fill orders for customers. Sometimes Santa even surprised people with extra helpings. "Oh, I couldn't eat another bite," many of them insisted. Well, maybe just one. But there was a problem. Every night Santa tasted and sampled and tasted some more. Before he brought anything out of the kitchen, he gained a lot of weight. Hoping to get some exercise, Santa then found a spot at the zoo. He was very organized about the animals. "I know when they are sleeping," said Santa, "and when they are awake." Over time, he also learned whether they were behaving themselves or not. But there was a problem. Santa became close friends with the reindeer, and all the other animals got jealous. Sadly, the zookeeper had to let him go. By now, Santa was starting to get discouraged. He didn't even notice what the reindeer were doing behind him. They worked hard to cheer him up. Together, they joined the circus. Soon the reindeer were shooting Santa out of a cannon 3 times a night. Santa liked flying through the air and wearing his new costume. He was a big success. But there was a problem. The ringmaster wanted to build up the suspense. "You need to look frightened," he told Santa. "We want the crowd to worry about you." But Santa was having too much fun for that. "Ho, ho, ho," he always cried as he flew through the air. So the crowd wasn't worried at all. The angry ringmaster soon fired Santa and the reindeer. As they gathered their things, some elves came looking for autographs. When they had heard the news, they invited Santa and the reindeer home for supper. The elves lived way out of town. They were toy makers, and their house was their workshop. Santa was amazed. "Children must love these toys," he said. The elves looked embarrassed. They only made toys for their own pleasure. Selling them was too much trouble. "What if you give them away?" Santa asked. The elves hadn't thought of that. "I could deliver them for you," Santa offered. There were enough toys here for children all over the world. The elves smiled and hired him on the spot. The elves made Santa a special sack that was always big enough, no matter how many toys were put into it. Then they built him a sleigh. The polar bears offered to pull it. They were very strong and whipped Santa across the snow, but there was a problem. It was the biggest one yet. And, to Santa's surprise, the problem could be solved. Santa and the reindeer practiced together every day. They made a few mistakes at first, but soon they learned to work as a team. In the darkest part of winter, when people need their spirits lifted the most, Santa got ready to go. As the elves said goodbye, they gave Santa an emergency kit. It held a compass, ski goggles, cough drops, and other things. Santa thanked them very much. All his jobs had taught him it was good to be prepared. Then Santa and his reindeer took off. That first night was a little hard because Santa was still learning about shortcuts and high winds, but at last he got the hang of it. Ever since then, the elves have made toys all year, and Santa has given them away in one night. He loves his job as much as ever, and he's gotten pretty good at it over the years. Still, he always keeps his emergency kit close by, because no job is perfect. Santa's Book of Names by David McPhail. Santa's Book of Names. Edward was good at numbers. He could count all the way to 50. He could recite the alphabet and knew the names of most of the dinosaurs. But when he opened a book and tried to read it, he just couldn't. Edward's teacher was concerned. She sent a note to Edward's mother and father urging that he be tested to find out what the problem was. No tests, Edward's mother wrote back. Patience. At bedtime on Christmas Eve, Edward's father read aloud Edward's favorite Christmas story. In the story, Santa Claus delivers presents to boys and girls around the world. How does Santa Claus remember the names of all those boys and girls he gives presents to? Edward asked when his father had finished. And where they live, and what toys to bring them? He must have a good memory, said Edward's father. Or maybe he has it all written down in a book, said Edward's mother as she came in to say goodnight. After his mother and father had kissed him and turned off the light, Edward took his flashlight from under his pillow and tried to read the story himself. He wanted more than anything to be able to read, and he almost could. Almost, but not quite. Just as he turned the last page, Edward heard a noise. He sat up and listened. Yes, there it is again. Edward slid out of bed and tiptoed downstairs. When he peeked into the living room, he saw that his stockings were filled and that there were presents under the tree. Santa had come and gone, and Edward had missed him. Then Edward noticed something else, something lying on the floor right at the foot of the fireplace. It was a book. He bent down and picked it up. The book was thick and heavy and probably very old, for the cover was worn and the pages were tattered. Santa must have dropped it, Edward suddenly realized. He ran to the front door, threw it open, and stepped outside. Just as he did, a long shadow passed over him and glided across the fresh, moonlit snow. "Santa, wait!" cried Edward. "You forgot your book!" But in the jingle of the sleigh bells and the rush of the wind, Santa didn't hear, and in an instant he was gone. How far could Santa get without his book, Edward wondered, and when Santa realized the book was missing, how would he know where to find it? Then Edward had an idea. He hurried back into the house, quickly put on his boots, mittens, coat, and hat. He knew what letter the word book started with, so he tromped out a huge letter B in the snow. Would Santa see it? And even if he did, would he know what it meant? Then Edward heard the sound of sleigh bells growing closer. He looked up. High overhead, Santa's sleigh appeared. It circled once, then went into a deep dive, gliding to a stop right beside Edward. "Hello, Edward. I see that you found my book," said Santa, who looked very much like the Santa in Edward's storybook, except that his nose wasn't round, it was pointed. "The book contains the names and addresses of all the children in the world," Santa explained. "Most of them I know by heart, but I can't always remember which present to leave. That's why I need my book." Edward held the book out to Santa. "Thank you, Edward," said Santa, and he gently patted Edward's shoulder. "It would be a big help if you would come along and read it to me when I forget something." Ride with Santa in his sleigh? Edward couldn't believe his ears. He stared down at the glistening snow. I can't help you, Santa, he stammered. I can't read. Come along anyway. You can hold the book open so the pages don't blow, said Santa. I promise I'll have you back before dawn. Edward smiled. Okay, he said, and he jumped into the sleigh beside Santa, who bundled him up in thick woolen robes and placed the open book on his lap. Then Santa gave a low whistle, and the reindeer lunged forward, lifting the sleigh into the crisp, clean air. From rooftop to rooftop they went. At each stop, Santa would disappear down the chimney with a small bag full of toys. Presently, they came to a great city. Skyscrapers, dark and silent, loomed around and above them as Santa made his way from one apartment house to the next. 1,000,000 children must live in this city, thought Edward, and Santa delivers toys to every one of them. How he did it, Edward couldn't say. Does time slow down, he wondered, or even stop on Christmas Eve while Santa goes about his work? On they went to the other cities and to every town and village in between. I'll go wherever there's a child, Santa said. All this time, Edward had been holding the book and turning the pages so that Santa, his glasses balanced on the end of his nose, could glance over and read what was written beside each name. He read aloud Pablo Lopez, paint set, and Lucy Wells, baseball mitt, as Edward followed along. They were crossing a vast ocean, skimming above waves, when a huge seabird flew in front of them. As they went past the bird, the tip of its wing brushed Santa's glasses and sent them spinning. Down, down the glasses fell until, with a faint splash, they entered the dark sea and disappeared. Oh, no. Oh, dear, Santa exclaimed. Now I really need your help, Edward. Do you think you can read the words to me? Edward knew Santa was counting on him. I'll try, he said. Good, said Santa. I was up to the 7th name on the page, Ben Hill. Edward counted down the page to the number 7. Beside the name was the word that looked familiar to him. Edward began. That's right, Santa said. Just sound it out. Book, said Edward. Book. A book it is, then, declared Santa as he landed the sleigh and stepped out. What's next, Edward? Santa asked upon his return. Edward looked up at Santa. Doll, he said proudly. After that, Edward continued to read the words to Santa, and while Santa was delivering one present, Edward was getting another one ready to go. Finally, they were finished. Edward closed the book of names and placed it on the seat beside him as Santa emerged from the last chimney and took one final present from his bag. It was a book. Merry Christmas, said Santa as he handed the book to Edward. Thank you for all your help. I couldn't have done it without you. Then he took up the reins once more, and in an instant they were streaking through the dawning sky. Edward opened his book to the first page and stared down at the words. He must have fallen asleep on his way home, because the next thing he knew, his mother was gently shaking him and softly calling his name. Merry Christmas, Edward, she whispered. Time to wake up and see what Santa Claus brought you. Edward opened his eyes. He was lying on the sofa in front of the fireplace. Look at what Santa left you, said Edward's father as he bent down and picked up the book. Would you like me to read it to you? Edward smiled. No thanks, Dad, he replied. Let me read it to you. And he did. Who'll Pull Santa's Sleigh Tonight by Laura Rader. Who will pull Santa's sleigh tonight? Christmas was just around the corner. The toys were wrapped, the lists were checked, Santa's sleigh was polished and ready to go. Let's visit the reindeer, said Santa to Mrs. Claus. As they approached the stable, Santa called out, "Hello, Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, and Vixen. Hello, Comet, Cupid, Donder, and Blitzen. Are you ready to fly?" The answer was a loud, "Achoo!" "Goodness gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. Claus. "The reindeer look miserable." "We all have bad colds," said Dancer. "Poor dear," said Mrs. Claus. "They feel terrible." Santa rushed off to tell the elves. "The reindeer are sick. Who'll pull the sleigh?" he asked. "We need a backup plan." Santa paced up and down. He scratched his head and looked serious. Then he had an idea. "We'll find stand-ins," he said. The auditions were announced. A large crowd lined up to try out. The performers were very unusual. The winged monkeys, the amazing Micquacks, the flyaway hares, the happy hoofers, so were their acts. None was right for the job. Now I think I've seen it all. Poor Santa. Who'll pull the sleigh? Santa went to his workshop. He thought, he sketched, he thought some more. He had an idea. "Here's my new plan," said Santa. There were a few grumbles and groans, but Santa and the elves went to work. They worked hard. They worked fast. At last they finished. "We did it!" shouted Santa. "Let's show Mrs. Claus." It was the biggest idea Santa had ever had. Santa prepared for a test flight. It's a blimp. It looks like a reindeer blimp. The balloon went up, up, and up. Hooray! The balloon came down, down, and down. Oh! The balloon was deflated. So was Santa. "I'm all out of ideas," he sighed. "I'll bring you a cup of hot cocoa," said Mrs. Claus. Santa sipped the cocoa. "Ah," he said, "this always makes me feel good as new." Santa and Mrs. Claus looked at each other. "I have an idea," said Santa. "Do you think?" "Yes, I do," she finished. Santa and Mrs. Claus took a big pot of cocoa to the reindeer. "I hope this works," said Santa. The reindeer stopped sniffling. They stopped sneezing. They looked much better. They were ready to fly. "Hot cocoa saved the day," Mrs. Claus said. Everyone cheered as they flew out of sight. "Hot cocoa for all, and to all a good night." And there's the recipe for hot cocoa. Auntie Claus by Elise Primavera. Auntie Claus. The Kringle family lived high atop the luxurious Bing Cherry Hotel in New York City, and they loved Christmas. They kept a Christmas tree up all year round. Mr. Kringle was president of the renowned Jingle Bell Bell Company. Mrs. Kringle owned the fabulous Mistletoe Nail Salon over on 56th and 5th. They had even named their young son after you-know-who. Sophie and her little brother had everything. But if you asked, was it enough? No, they would say. Was it enough to have their own private soda fountain? No! They would shake their heads and back and forth. or clothes and books galore. No, 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 they would scream. It had been suggested by their great aunt, Auntie Claus, that maybe Sophie and her little brother were given too many presents. You can never have too many presents, Sophie. That's my motto. Yes, everyone in the Kringle family loved Christmas, but no one loved it more than Auntie Claus. Auntie Claus lived at the Bing as well, penthouse 25C. Every afternoon, Sophie was summoned there for tea. Each day, Auntie Claus would instruct Sophie on a different topic. One day it might be Christmas trees. Always pick a nice full one, darling, with springy needles. Another day, decorating. You must drape the garland, darling, one strand at a time. You must never throw it on. After they finished tea, Auntie Claus would close with these words of wisdom. And, darling, always remember my first and final rule. Whether it's birthdays, Christmas, or Halloween, it is far better to give than it is to receive. Sophie wondered about her great aunt a lot. She's so mysterioso, Sophie thought, and this was true. There were many strange going-ons up in penthouse 25C. Most people considered Auntie Claus just another eccentric New Yorker, but Sophie knew that there was more to her than met the eye. For instance, what was the diamond key that always hung from a silver ribbon around her neck? Just a bit of costume jewelry, darling, her great aunt would say, then quickly change the subject. Why did Auntie Claus leave every year right after Halloween and not return until Valentine's Day? Just a business trip, darling, and she'd change the subject again. Where does she go? Sophie wanted to know. Once again, it was Halloween, and Auntie Claus announced, in 1 week I'm off on my annual business trip. What kind of business are you in anyway? Sophie had asked. That, darling, is something for me to know and you to find out, Auntie Claus had said with a twinkle in her eye. And that was exactly what Sophie intended to do. This year I have a plan. I'll stow away. Sophie had made up her mind. As she was leaving, Sophie said, I'm going on a business trip with Auntie Claus. Marvelous, darling. Be home in time for Christmas. There's a good girl, said her mother. Do take your mittens, said her father. I'm going too, said her little brother. Oh, no, you're not, said Sophie. Can if I want to, he said. Cannot, she said. Can too, he cried. Cannot, she yelled. Wah! Sophie could hear his ear-splitting scream start to fade as she ran out the door. Sophie tiptoed into Auntie Claus's apartment. There were many boxes and trunks waiting to go. Choosing the largest, Sophie pushed aside the capes and furs and wriggled inside. Quietly, she made a little peephole in the cardboard so she could see everything that was going on. Auntie Claus entered the room. She removed the diamond key that hung from the ribbon around her neck. Next, she placed the key into the lock of her old elevator. The door slid open. The boxes and trunks were loaded. The door slid shut. Vroom! The elevator shot up in the air and out into space. They were going up, up, up. Minutes, an hour passed, and still they were going up. Sophie could feel it getting colder and colder from her peephole. She could see stars zipping by. Or was that snow? We can't possibly be in New York any longer, she thought. The elevator landed with a thunk, tipping over Sophie's box. She could no longer see, but she thought she heard cheers. The sound soon faded until all became completely silent. Thinking it safe, she climbed out of the box. Where am I? Sophie whispered. You must be the new elf, the little man said. That's it, said Sophie. I'm the new elf. Who are you? I'm Mr. Pudding, he said. Oh dear, you're in violation of elf rule number 3. What do you mean? Asked Sophie indignantly. He pulled a worn green and red book from his pocket. On the cover it read, Elf Rules and Vital Information. He pointed to the section marked Dress Code. Sophie read out loud, "Always look neat, always look snappy, a well-dressed elf always feels happy." "Follow me," he said, and trotted off into the darkness. "Where are we going?" shouted Sophie. "Hurry, hurry," Mr. Pudding called over his shoulder. "Over 48 days left." Only 48 days left. Mr. Pudding put Sophie right to work in the mailroom. It seemed to her as good a place as any to begin her search. Where was Auntie Claus, and what was she doing here? For days Sophie lived among the elves and did her best to blend in. She slept on a cot in the elf dormitory. She ate her meals in the cafeteria. No one suspected. Every day Mr. Pudding appeared. "Hello, Elfie Sophie, settling in?" he asked. "The uniform is itchy. The hours are long," said Sophie. "This is hard work." Oh dear, Mr. Pudding," said Mr. Pudding. He pulled the old green and red book from his pocket. "Elf rule number 2, Mr. Pudding recited. An elf's work is never done, but hard work never hurt anyone." "Rules, smooles," thought Sophie. For weeks Sophie looked high and low for Auntie Claus, but now it was almost Christmas Eve and she had turned up nothing. Sophie was worried. If she didn't find Auntie Claus, how could she get home? If she didn't get home, how could she get all her Christmas presents? Just then Mr. Pudding appeared. "Hello, Elfie Sophie," he said. "Good news. You have excelled in the mailroom and may proceed to package wrapping. After that, we'll all pitch in on sleigh packing." "I'm not going to package wrapping, and I'm not going to sleigh packing. I want to go home," Sophie yelled. "I have to get all my—" But before she could finish, Santa's voice interrupted over the PA system. "It's that time of year again," his voice boomed, "and I was hoping one of you would volunteer to go to the coal mines and pick up the BB&G list." So Sophie whispered to Mr. Pudding, "What's the BB&G list?" "BB&G," he shivered, "is short for bad boys and girls. Any boy or girl on that list goes without presents or worse for Christmas." Sophie swallowed hard. "Uh-oh," she thought. Mr. Pudding continued, "Only the bravest elf would volunteer for such an awful job." "Yes, a brave elf," thought Sophie, "or else a girl who thinks she might be on that list." She raised her hand high. "I'll go," she said. Oh dear," Mr. Pudding said. As Sophie made her way toward the coal mines, she could hear the chanting of the BB&G elves. "Spoiled brats and crybabies, wine babies, and all the ones who don't believe. Here's some coal and here's some gunk. Fill a stocking that smells like skunk." Sophie went down, 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 where it became darker and darker. Finally, she reached the very bottom. There was the list. Sophie looked for her name, but it wasn't her name she saw on the list. It was, "My own little brat of a brother," she cried. "Chris is on the bad boys and girls list." Well, she thought, once she'd gotten past the shock of it, they do kind of have a point. But then she pictured the two of them on Christmas morning. There would be lots of presents for her and nothing for her little brother. On his favorite day of the year, Chris would find only a stinky stocking filled with coal and gunk. "He will be so disappointed. He will be so sad," Sophie said. She quickly erased his name, but now there was a large telltale gap. There was only one thing to do. Sophie took a deep breath and wrote down her own name instead. The ink wasn't even dry on the page when some kind of really strong magic happened. Right before her eyes, the list, the BB&G elves, and the coal mines vanished, and Sophie was whirling around and around, hurling through the air in a blur of Christmas red and green. Was she up? Was she down? Sophie was standing on the stage in the grand ballroom. A clock struck midnight. Santa began to speak. "She's always on time. She works harder than anyone I know, including me. Ho, ho, ho. In short, she does things right, and I would be lost without her. Let's have a big round of applause for my sister." The curtain opened. "Auntie Claus!" Sophie shouted. "Auntie Claus!" Everybody cheered. "Hooray for Auntie Claus!" Turning to Sophie, Auntie Claus winked and said, "Come along, darling. You must be home in time for Christmas." Sophie was about to climb onto the sleigh when Mr. Pudding appeared. He was waving the green and red book in the air. Oh dear, he cried. Auntie Claus, Sophie can't leave until she knows the first and final rule. See, it says so right here under departing procedures. The reindeer stomped restlessly and shook their heads as if to say, let's go, let's go. Sophie knows the first and final rule, Mr. Pudding, Auntie Claus said. I do, said Sophie. Yes, you do. Now hop onto the sleigh. There's a good girl. Sophie jumped onto the sleigh and it rose up into the sky. Goodbye, goodbye, she called. She could barely hear her aunt's voice over the wind and the snow. I knew you had it in you. Merry Christmas, darling. The sleigh picked up speed. Ho, 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 Santa laughed as the stars whizzed by. Sophie closed her eyes. Her face stung with the cold. When Sophie opened her eyes, she could hardly believe she was in her own bed again. She ran downstairs toward the living room. Please let him get his present, she whispered to herself. Under the tree was her little brother. His cheeks were red, his eyes sparkled, his belly shook with laughter. Merry Christmas, Sophie, he bellowed. Merry Christmas, Chris, Sophie said with great relief. It was then that she realized, Auntie Claus is right. I do know the first and final rule, she said to herself. It is far better to give than it is to receive. There is something here for you, her mother and father said proudly. They handed Sophie a tiny box with a card. Inside was a diamond key hanging from a red ribbon. It's from Auntie Claus, Sophie said. Where is Auntie Claus anyway? Chris piped in. On a business trip, darling, Sophie said, and smiled mysteriously. Suddenly a thought occurred to Chris. She's never here on Christmas, he said. What kind of business is she in anyway? That's something for me to know and you to find out, Sophie said to her little butterball of a brother. And someday he would, but that's another story. Rockstar Santa by Gayle Krause, illustrated by Will Terry. Rock the house, don't be quiet like a mouse. Guitar, licks, and jammin' drums. Rock the house when Santa comes. Footlights shine, tree is lit. Play it like you'll never quit. Sleigh bells ring above the noise. Santa is bringing more than toys. Children clap and yell and scream when they first see Santa's team. Stomping joins the loud applause. Rock the house for Santa Claus. Donner plays electric bass. Blitzen wears a painted face. Comet shoots across the stage. Hip-hop dancer all the rage. Dasher croons into the mics. Vixen wears her hair in spikes. Cupid's jazzy kisses jingle. Stage is set for old Kris Kringle. Lights go up, guitars blast. It's Christmas now, not Christmas past. Singing back up, prancers slick. Spotlight centers on St. Nick. Red silk scarf hangs from his neck. In sequin vest he is bedecked. Snow white hair and ponytail. Santa's ready, watch him wail. He marks the beat, looks at the crowd. Now it's time. Scream really loud. He grabs the mic, takes one step back, and poof! The Christmas stage goes black. The Christmas concert felt so real. I heard the children screech and squeal. I saw Santa dancing there while silver snowflakes filled the air. I must have dreamed this awesome sight, 'cause Santa flies throughout the night, bringing all his special toys on Christmas Eve to girls and boys. But getting dressed on Christmas morn. Inside my jeans a ticket torn. Green spangles glimmer on the floor. A long red scarf hangs from my drawer. My window glints with frosted ice. Peering through, I must look twice. A silver snowflake flitters there, gleaming in the crisp cold air. Beside the flake, a written phrase that keeps me in my Christmas days. On Christmas Eve, I am the man. Merry Christmas to my biggest fan. Loves, Santa. Santa's Noisy Night by Julie Sykes and Tim Warnes. Santa's Noisy Night. It was Christmas Eve, and Santa was feeling jolly. Jingle bells, jingle all the way, sang Santa noisily as he loaded the toys into his sleigh. Shh, Santa, whispered the reindeer. You have to be quiet tonight or you'll wake up the children. I'll try to, said Santa, but I do like singing. Over the earth they flew toward the first house. Santa was so excited that he forgot to land on the roof and ended up in the front yard instead. Dear me, dear me, dear me, roared Santa, spying a friendly cat. Merry Christmas, cat. Do you think they'll mind if I use the back door? The cat waved her tail in the air. Shh, Santa, she whispered. They won't mind, but you mustn't wake the children. Of course I won't, said Santa, jumping out of the sleigh. Santa threw the sack of presents over his shoulder and tiptoed along the garden path. The house was silent and everyone was asleep except for the snowman in the yard. Oh, oops, cried Santa, sliding on a patch of ice and crashing to the ground. Shh, Santa, says the snowman. You mustn't wake the children. Sorry, said Santa, picking up his presents and bouncing indoors, but Christmas is my favorite time of year. When he reached the Christmas tree, Santa stopped bouncing and pulled some presents out of his sack. One was a jack-in-the-box, which burst open. Santa jumped in surprise. He laughed, clapping his hands. Shh, Santa, whispered the family's dog. You mustn't wake the children. No, we mustn't wake the children, agreed Santa. He put his finger to his lips and crept toward the fireplace to fill the stockings. But he didn't notice the tinsel on the floor until it was too late. Santa tripped and went bumpity-bump across the room, landing on a roller skate. Toys flew everywhere as he skidded across the carpet and fell headfirst into the fireplace. Achoo, sneezed Santa, rubbing the soot from his nose. Shh, Santa, said the kitten sleepily from an armchair by the hearth. You mustn't wake the children. Yes, we must be quiet, whispered Santa, scrambling to his feet. Santa picked up his sack and hurried back to his sleigh, for there were many more places to go before Christmas Day. Finally, they visited the last house, and Santa's sack was empty. Santa rubbed his eyes sleepily and called, Home, reindeer! And with a toss of their heads and a jingle of bells, the reindeer leapt into the sky. Ho, 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 shouted Santa loudly. Here we are, home at last. I know, he added softly. We mustn't wake the children. It had been a busy night, and Santa felt very tired. He made himself a cup of hot cocoa, put on his slippers, lay back in his armchair, and fell fast asleep. Zzz, snored Santa. Munch, 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 crunched the reindeer as they ate their supper. Shh, squeaked Santa's little mouse. You mustn't wake Santa. The Year Without a Santa Claus by Phyllis McGinley, illustrated by John Manders. The Year Without a Santa Claus. Have you been told? Did you ever hear of the curious, furious, fidgety year when Santa Claus unhitched his sleigh and vowed he was taking a holiday? How did it happen? This way. It was long ago, before you were living. Not yet Christmas, but past Thanksgiving, though I can't give you the very date. Santa got up that morning late, pulled on one boot, then its twin, ruffled his whiskers on his chin, and sat back down on the side of the bed. Great North Star, I'm tired, he said. Painting wagons red and bright, sharpening ice skates half the night, wrapping presents and ribbons and gauze, has worn me weary, said Santa Claus. Crick in my back, cold in my nose, aches in my fingers and all 10 toes, and a sort of kind of a kink inside whenever I think of that Christmas ride. Into his workroom limped the saint. He sniffed the varnish, he smelled the paint, and reeling feeling came over him, stealing to see things crammed from floor to ceiling. Rocking horses with shaggy manes, balls, dolls, electric trains, gloves, mitts, doctor kits, rubber boots, cowboy suits, kites flying in parts, bicycles, Noah's arks. And he started to shake and he started to shiver at the thought of the load that he soon must deliver. And he sighed, oh dear, as he buttoned his vest. I wish one year I could take a rest. When the words were out, he stood stock still, and then he whispered, I think I will. I will, he cried with his eyes ablaze. Everyone else gets holidays. Sailors and tailors and cooks do. Policemen and writers and books do. Tamers of lions and leopards, preachers and teachers and shepherds and watchmen and Scotchmen and Spaniards and Turks, butchers and bakers and grocery clerks. They take time off at Christmas nears, all except me, so it appears. That, saint or not, it's time I got my first vacation in 1,000 years. Out in the stable, nuzzling hay, the reindeer dreamed of Christmas Day, but Santa phoned to the reindeer groom, hang up the harness in the big storeroom. He called to his elves, he told each gnome, cover up the shelves, we're staying home. What? Cover the shelves, cried the gnomes and the elves. Cover the dolls and the electric trains and the rocking horses with the shaggy manes and the rubber boots for splashing in parks and the cowboy suits and the Noah arks. Alas, alack, for they couldn't believe he wouldn't go riding on Christmas Eve. Put 'em away, roared Santa, vexed. This year's presents will do for the next. Warn the people, tell the papers, I'm much too tired for Christmas capers. Crick in my back, a cold that lingers, aches in my toes and all 10 fingers. A bit of lumbago, touch of gout, climbing down chimneys is simply out. I may be the saint of Christmas nation, but this is the year of my first vacation. Well, you can imagine more or less what happened when that news reached the press. Headlines screamed, wires went humming. Santa says, too tired, not coming. And as the word flashed far and wide, you should have heard how the children cried. So violently they sobbed their griefs, the shops ran out of handkerchiefs. Their tears filled up the kitchen sinks and cellars and empty skating rinks. They wept in school. At play they wept, they dampened their pillows while they slept. Before those darlings' eyes got drier, all the rivers rose 3 feet higher. And I don't know what would have happened quite, except for Ignatius Thistlewhite. Ignatius Thistlewhite was a boy in Texas, or was it Illinois? 6 years old, but brave for his years. He sobbed no sobs and he wept no tears, but stood up tall in his class to say, Santa deserves a holiday. No, 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 came the children's plaint. What is Christmas without our saint? Shucks now, fellows, gosh, good gracious. Christmas is Christmas, cried Ignatius, and everyone tells me whom I've met. It's a day to give as well to get. Since all these years in the children's cause, Santa's been giving without one pause. Let's pull together in this Christmas weather and give this year to Santa Claus. Hooray, his classmates said. He's right, 3 cheers for Ignatius Thistlewhite. Fast as a hurricane, children hurled that happy message around the world, over each continent, isle, and isthmus. Let's give Santa a Merry Christmas. With snow, the earth was already whitening, but they rolled up their sleeve and worked like lightning. They opened their piggy banks, racked their brains. They chartered buses and special trains and ships and sledges and hydroplanes. To reach the pole by the 24th was all their goal. East, south, west, north came gifts and gifts and gifts to spare from clever children everywhere. Slippers with zippers to zip on, soap for his bath or to slip on, geraniums pink in a pot, one guppy, one puppy, one named Spot, balsam pillows, strawberry jam, dressing gowns with his monogram, 10 harmonicas for him to play on, hand-painted pictures done in crayon, mufflers, pipes, an easy chair, and lots of winter underwear. In New York State, a boy called Pudge cooked him a plate of homemade fudge. The little girl guides of Britain each made him a scarlet mitten, while the boy in Siam sent a Siamese kitten. They sent him lemon drops by the carton, ashtrays modeled in kindergarten, jackknives, pen wipers, cakes and crullers, and magic pencils that wrote 3 colors. Tots who hadn't a penny to spend wrote him letters signed "A Friend." And then they had more fun, that strange December, they said, than they could ever remember. Up at the pole in the fragrant hay, the idle reindeer dreamed at play. Comet nickered out for oats and corn, Dancer brandized his velvet horn, while sadly, sorrowfully lounged at home each idle elf and gnome. Santa sat poking the fire and blinking, but nobody knew what he was thinking. Then suddenly from the sky there came the sound of planes, and heard the hoot and cry of ships and special trains. Noel totaled the sledges, honk the buses cried, and out of his study window Santa put his head. He looked to the left, he stared to the right, he didn't trust his own eyesight. So many, so merry, so more and more packages were rolling to his front door. Smack at his doorsill they thundered, 1,000,000, 1,000, 100, flat ones and fat ones, and lean ones, and crimson and silver and green ones, broad ones and odd ones, and plain, romantic ones, little, big, and great, gigantic ones, parcels from London, Rome, Atlanta, and each addressed alike to Santa. Atop them all a banner glinted, where Ignatius Thistlewhite had printed these words: "Good luck and holiday mirth from all the children upon the earth." With hoots and toots and honks and light-hearted, the buses turned and the trains departed, leaving the saint surrounded by parcels piled to the polar sky. Santa was silent for a minute. His eye looked bright, but a tear stood in it. Then he blew his nose like a trumpet blast. "God bless my soul," he said at last. "By the big Borealis, by my maps and charts, I didn't know children had such kind hearts. How could a man feel gladder, prouder?" He turned to his staff, and his voice got louder. "Gnomes, elves, every mother's son, don't stand staring, there's work to be done. Bring in the barrels, fetch in the boxes, carry in those packages, and don't break one. Where to put them? There wasn't a space in a parlor or study or any place. They overflowed bureau, couch, and table, filled the house, the sheds, and the stables, slid from mantels, jammed the casement, bulged from attic, and burst from basement. There's nothing to do," exclaimed the elves, "except to empty some woodshop shelves." Off those shelves then Santa forces whisked the painted rocking horses. When the presents wouldn't fit, down came kite and doctor kit. Still there wasn't room for all, so away went basketball, cowboy suit, and rubber boot, bicycle, and talking doll. Till by the time the twilight reigned, not a single toy on the shelves remained. All were sacked and packed away in the one place left, the Christmas sleigh. Then Santa gazed from floor to rafter and gave his mightiest shout of laughter, laughed loud ho-hos, laughed vast ha-has. What a joke, he chortled, on Santa Claus. You might as well phone the reindeer groom to take down the harness to in the big storeroom. Get me my gloves, the robe for my lap, and my coat and my warmest stocking cap. There sits the sleigh with the toys inside, so what can I do tonight but ride? What about your gout? The gnomes cried out. What about your aches and the crick in your spine? Pooh, laughed Santa, my back feel fine. Never felt younger, never felt stronger. Haven't got a symptom any longer. And before the midnight bells go chiming, I'd like to do some chimney climbing. So harness the reindeer, let 'em rip. It's time to begin my favorite trip. With a flurry and a scurry and a chatter and a hurry, they brought him his cap and his lap robe fury. They roused the Cupid, they rubbed down Vixen, they polished the bells on Donner and Blixen. There were cheers from the gnomes, from the elves, applause. Then off through the night flew Santa Claus. And I've heard the old people often say there never was such a Christmas day, never such joy after Santa swirled from rooftop to rooftop around the world. While at home of a sleepy boy in Texas, or was it Illinois, a special letter was left that night addressed to Ignatius Thistlewhite. It was clipped to the handlebars like a medal of the best two-wheeled a boy could pedal. Dear Sir, was written in Santa's hand, please thank the children in every land. Tell them I'll take good care, I hope, of the puppy and the guppy and the slippery slope. I like my pipes, I love my chair, I do appreciate the underwear, and I pledge this promise on my sled and pack, year after year, I'll be coming back. Vacations, I guess, weren't meant for me. I'll never want another one. Yours, S.C. And that's one reason you may believe why children are merry on Christmas Eve. You know yourself, as you hang your stocking, it doesn't matter if the wind's a-knocking. Through the storm falls heavy, though the storm falls heavy, though the great gale roars, though nobody else would budge outdoors, snug in your bed while the tempest drums, you can count your blessings on fingers and thumbs. For yearly, nearly, faithfully, truly, somehow, Santa Claus always comes. The Night Before Christmas by Clement Moore, illustrated by Jacqueline Rogers. The Night Before Christmas. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mamma in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters, and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wandering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before a wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with a sleigh full of toys and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry, his droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work. And filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying a finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."